Halvar held firm the steering oar as he watched his crew bustle before him. Some men baled water over the gunwales, others trimmed the sail as it flapped wildly against a sudden headwind, and yet others groaned in unison as they rowed against the wind-whipped waters, which crashed against the hull in sprays of churning sea mist. The days had begun to blur together since they had departed from the barren, icy shores of Greenland, itself a world away from the lush forests and fjords of his Norwegian homeland. Day after day they had pressed on across an endless sapphire horizon, keeping faith that the pole star above would guide them true across the ocean. Halvar heard a shriek overhead, gazing up to see seabirds circling in the overcast skies above. Moments later, a mighty cliff-edged coastline emerged from the fog, towering like the giants of Jotunheimer. Halvar unleashed a triumphant whoop alongside his cheering crew. They had completed the trail blazed by Leif Erikson before them. Vinland awaited. While Halvar and his crew are fictional, the remarkable journey they made to the eastern seaboard of Canada was not, nor were the robust vessels upon which the intrepid men of Scandinavia raided, traded and voyaged from Persia to the New World. In this video we will explore the history of Viking longships, examining how they were constructed, crewed, and how they enabled the Vikings to become the greatest sea power of the medieval world. And once you see how it was done, go do it yourself with our sponsor today, Mount & Blade 2 Bannerlord with their new Warsails DLC. Just as the Vikings made their mark across the world, Bannerlord's lands of Calradia are about to face an invasion from the new Nord faction coming in this DLC. And that invasion will of course be over water, as this DLC's headline feature is fully fledged naval combat. Whether you're using historically inspired Nord longships or the pitiful attempts at ships from the landlubbers, you'll be able to clash hull to hull, using ranged weapons to mow down crews. Then of course you can grab an axe and leap onto enemy decks to get the job done with true Viking finesse. The map has been expanded to include new Nord lands, featuring a nice island to scheme away on, and has loads of new troop types, weapons, companions, skills, and of course ships, mainly focusing on making the seas your dominion. You can even go full Viking and sail up the rivers to land your forces deep behind enemy lines, or perhaps you'll lead the more civilized folk to destroy the Nord scourge and seize the riches they've accrued. Of course, with Mount & Blade, the journey will be up to you. The Warsails DLC has just released, so grab it with our links below right now and expand your kingdom or destroy someone else's like never before. Throughout the 9th century CE, one thing that the Franks, Anglo-Saxons, Khazars, Slavs, Greeks and Arabs had in common was that they were equally unprepared for how quickly the men of the north could strike, with Patriarch Photius of Eastern Rome likening the abrupt appearance of Varangian marauders before the sea walls of Constantinople to a thunderbolt from heaven. The Vikings owed their stunning success to the iconic seacraft that enabled their long-range raiding tactics. Much like the British Empire of the 19th century, it was through naval might that the heathen Norsemen became a global force, conquering lands from Ireland to Russia, and mastering riverine trade routes which stretched from Sweden to Mesopotamia. The key to the Longship's military success lay in its shallow hull. Other ships usually had deeper keels, which were easily caught on shoals, reefs and sandbars, forcing them to anchor further out to sea and ferry men to shore by skiffs. In contrast, the Longship's low profile allowed it to pull right up upon beaches, taking coastal settlements by surprise, and quickly pulling out with their plunder before a counterforce could be assembled to meet them. Another advantage of the Longship's strength in shallow waters was its ability to sail directly up rivers. Whereas other warships posed a threat only to a kingdom's coasts, Viking longboats could penetrate deep into enemy territory, threatening cities deep inland. In the west, it was the Longship's mastery of waterways like the Rhine, Seine, Thames and Severn that carried Viking raiders to Paris, and the great heathen army deep into the heart of Anglo-Saxon England. To the east, the Longship's domination over the Don, Dnieper and Volga rivers enabled Norse warriors to tap into the highly lucrative markets of the Abbasid Caliphate and make contact with the Eastern Roman Empire, where many Norsemen would come to serve as the elite bodyguards of the Roman Emperor. While rowing their way down to these mighty southern empires, the men of the Longships also became the ruling elite of a confederation of Slavic tribes, known as the Kievan Rus, the medieval predecessor to the modern nations of Ukraine, Belarus and Russia. Like all martial cultures before them, the Vikings understood the power of psychological warfare, and designed their warships accordingly. Such was the decoration of the ships, recorded the 1041 Encomium me regine, that to those who were looking from afar, they seemed to be made more of flame than wood. So great was the appearance of the fleet, that if its lord had wished to conquer any people, the ship alone would have terrified the enemy, even before the warriors aboard could join battle. Unlike the Roman vessels that in part inspired their development, the Viking longship was not a battleship. Its primary purpose was not to engage in combat, nor did it possess the ballistae or ramming equipment that ancient vessels such as the trireme had. However, the longship was versatile enough to be used in naval combat from time to time, in which the Norsemen would tie their seacraft together to create a large mobile platform to do battle on, or shower arrows, javelins, or other forms of missile fire upon enemy vessels from their decks. The cultural importance of the longship to the Viking Age Scandinavians is plain enough to see in the archaeological remains and stories they left behind, with the likeness of longships appearing in thousand-year-old graffiti on the streets of Viking-era Dublin, in equally old toy boats made for children, and on coins minted by Danish kings in the 9th century. Longships were a symbol of wealth, power, and status. They were expensive to build, owned only by the elites of Nordic society, and famously carried the most powerful of Norse jarls and kings into Valhalla. The Viking funeral rite of ship burning is among the most ubiquitous clichés in any Viking-themed piece of pop culture, and there appears to be some truth to the stereotype. The 10th century Arab traveller Ibn Fadlan describes the death of a Norse chieftain on the Volga River, who was cremated within his vessel alongside a slave girl, sacrificed to accompany him to the afterlife. Ship burnings, however, were just one of the several variations in which Viking boats ferried souls into Odin's halls. Within Scandinavia proper, funerary longships appear to have been buried beneath the earth, alongside the body of the deceased chieftain, and a panoply of Greek silks, Arab silver, and other material wealth acquired through plunder, tribute, or trade. Unlike ship burnings, which presumably incinerated anything of value, ship burials have provided us with some rare examples of relatively well-preserved Viking vessels, such as the Oseberg and Gokstad ships, which were excavated in southern Norway and dated to 834 CE and 905 CE respectively. These longships, now on display at the Viking Ship Museum in Oslo, have enabled modern historians to gain a wealth of knowledge about how Viking vessels were crewed and sailed, as well as how they evolved from older ship designs dating back to Scandinavia's prehistoric past. The famous Norse longship did not simply pop into being in 793 AD, the moment that the Norsemen decided they were going to skip over to Northumbria and pillage some monasteries. The culmination of an ancient shipbuilding tradition, the ancestry of the Viking longship can be traced back through its distinctive shingle-like clinker-built hull, which was also a feature in earlier stages of Scandinavian shipbuilding. The earliest known ancestor of the Viking longship is the Hjortspring boat, preserved in a bog in Denmark, and dated to around 350 BC, making it roughly contemporary with a young Alexander the Great. The Hjortspring boat features a hull composed of two overlapping planks on each side, with a central plank in between. It lacks many of the features of later Viking ships, such as oar ports, a steering blade, or a sail, yet is generally considered to represent an early stage in the Norse clinker-building tradition. The next major link in this evolutionary chain is the Nidam boat, also found preserved in a Danish bog, and dated to approximately 320 CE, making it contemporary with the Roman Emperor Constantine. Like its Hjortspring predecessor, the clinker-built Nidam boat also lacks a mast and sail, yet it had developed several features also found on the Viking-era longships it predates, including oar ports and a steering blade on its starboard side for improved navigation. These innovations were likely adapted from the ancient Romans, who bore extensive trade links with southern Scandinavia at the height of their power. Further development is represented by the burial ship from Sutton Hoo in Suffolk, England. Dated to around 600 CE, the Sutton Hoo ship was built by the earliest Anglo-Saxons, whose original homeland lay in southern Scandinavia and the surrounding areas. Its hull was clinker-built, and it possessed the starboard steering blade and oar ports distinctive to the Norse longship, although it also lacked the mast and sail of later Viking vessels. It is thus one of history's rhyming couplets that the Saxon rulers of England were later displaced by their Germanic cousins, who arrived in dragon-headed vessels very similar to the ships that had borne the Saxons to British shores centuries earlier. It was not until the late 8th century CE, when Scandinavian shipwrights adopted the sail from their southern Frankish neighbours, that their already robust rowboats transformed into the iconic long-ranging sailing ships that would inaugurate the Viking Age, and thrust the Norsemen forth from their North Sea neighbourhood onto vast seaborne odysseys to Africa, Asia, and even North America. At a glance, the design of the Viking Longship looks fairly simple, little more than a canoe. Yet the composition of the Longship was deceptively sophisticated. One of the secrets to their success was the aforementioned clinker-building technique. While other European vessels of the early Middle Ages were made up of planks aligned edge to edge, Norse longship hulls were clinker-built, that is, composed of planks that overlapped atop one another to create a roof shingle-like pattern. Clinker-built hulls had several advantages, significantly reducing water resistance, while reinforcing the overall structural integrity of the hull. In contrast to other types of shipbuilding, where a thick, heavy frame supported the planks of a ship's hull, the planks on a clinker-built hull were designed to help each other, allowing Viking longships to have thinner frames, which made the longship faster and more flexible. The finest woodworkers of their age, Norse shipwrights skillfully split tree trunks along their grain with a hammer and pegs to preserve the natural strength and flexibility of the wood, before whittling it down with an axe. This was highly specialized labor that professional shipwrights spent their lifetimes mastering, and the results were exceptionally vigorous vessels that united light weight, elasticity, and structural stability. The longship's primary steering mechanism was the side rudder, affixed to the right side of the hull. This steering blade, likely adapted from the Romans, and known as steerboard in Old English, is where the modern nautical direction of starboard derives from. The longship's single sail was usually made of flax or wool, and supported by rigging made of horsehair or walrus hide, affixed at the center of the hull on a mast that was held in place at the base by a keelson, a massive block of timber that mitigated the risk of the mast snapping under the heaviest of winds. We can assume that Norse sailors preferred to let the wind do the work for them, instead of busting their own rumps, but rowing was often necessary nonetheless. Oars were inserted through specialized portholes cut into the upper plank of the hull, and were used when near the coast or on a river, on calm, breezeless seas, or against adversarial headwinds. Norse longships did not come off a factory assembly line, and as such, varied greatly in size and shape, depending on when, where, and by whom they were built. Surviving sagas and skaldic verses have preserved several Old Norse words, seemingly used to refer to different types of longships. Smaller longships that might have carried crews of around 30 people appear to have been called kavi or sneka, meaning snake, while larger longships that may have carried crews of 60 or more were called skeid. A fourth type of longship was the dreki, meaning dragon. Dreki were not defined by their size, which was likely around the same as the skeid, but for the ornate carvings of a dragon's head and tail upon their prow and stern, presumably meant to ward off evil sea spirits and strike terror into their enemies. It should be noted that all of these terms are used ambiguously in the sources, leaving modern historians hesitant to categorize different types of Viking longships with precision. What historians are reasonably sure of is that Norse longships were not built exclusively for battle. At least initially, they were multi-purpose vessels that were part warship and part merchant vessel, both agile enough to be effective for raiding, yet broad and deep enough to carry plentiful cargo. This makes sense when one considers that the first Viking explorers were plunderers, not conquerors, and that they were as active as traders as they were as raiders. One iteration of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes the slaughter of a Saxon official and his men, who walked obliviously up to a group of Norse reavers that had landed on their shores after mistaking them for traders, presumably due to the mercantile-looking ships they'd arrived in. It was not until the later Viking Age, when the territorial conquest of places like Eastern Europe and the British Isles began, that Scandinavian warlords started to sponsor the development of dedicated warships, which introduced sleeker, longer, and shallower hulls that sacrificed cargo space for the ability to transport more warriors across the seas at greater speeds. Life aboard a Viking longship was cold, cramped, and uncomfortable, with the crew exposed to the elements and at the mercy of needle-like winds and waves crashing against the shallow gunwales. A sensible skipper tended to stick close to the coast, pulling up to land every night and beaching his ship, whereupon the crew would cook a hot meal of porridge from the provisions stored beneath the deck, before taking down the sail and laying it across the hull as a tent to sleep under. These were luxuries unavailable on open ocean journeys, during which crews likely bedded down under blankets made of seal and walrus skin, and subsisted on cold, salted fish. A Norwegian legal codex, dating back to the 11th century, called the Gulating, provides some insight about how the crew aboard a longship were separated by rank and duties. Normal crewmen were called holumen, and were tasked with rowing the oars, trimming the sail, keeping watch, and bailing water from the hull. The ship's helmsman was called the sundvode, and the crew may also have included a dedicated cook, a barber surgeon, and even a skaldic poet to entertain the sailors with story and song on the long journey. The most important man in any seafaring crew was the skipper, or styrmade in Old Norse. The skipper was appointed by the king to, among other things, organize the construction of a longship, select its crew, maintain discipline while at sea, and serve as the chief navigator. Unfortunately, we know little about the navigation techniques the Vikings used. Still, considering that their ships ranged from Africa to the Arctic Circle, they must have had deeply sophisticated ways of charting their way through unknown waters. They may have memorized currents, or read the stars, the sky, and the wind. They may also have used sunstones, a type of quartz that polarizes light, and when held up to the sky, can help determine the position of the sun, and thereby the latitude and heading of the ship. The narrative culmination of these seafaring techniques came around 1000 AD, when the crew of the Norse explorer Leif arrived upon the rugged, cliff-edged shores of a territory they called Vinland, having completed a 2,000-kilometer journey from Greenland to what are now the maritime provinces of Canada. The Norse longship outlived the end of the Viking Age by several centuries. Even after the kingdoms of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway embraced the Christian God and joined the rest of Europe in the Catholic world, the descendants of the Vikings continued to sail to battle in the same ships their pagan ancestors had. Throughout the 1200s CE, longships carried crusaders from Sweden and Denmark across the Baltic Sea to conquer Finland and the Baltic lands in the name of Christ. In a striking case of historical symmetry, the very same warships which had brought heathen marauders to the churches and monasteries of Christendom were now used by the Christian descendants of those raiders to subjugate the last pagan peoples of Europe. Yet, even by the time of the Northern Crusade, the longship was already becoming old-fashioned. As the Scandinavian world was fully integrated into Christendom, the importance of trading began to outstrip the importance of raiding, and the longship began to lose prominence to the cog, another class of clinker-built sailing ship popularized by the merchant cities of North Germany. Cogs were cheaper to build, carried twice as much cargo, and possessed broad, deep hulls and high defensible sides, which made them effective both as trading vessels and coastal defense, negating both the mercantile and military advantages which had long given the longship its edge. The kingdoms of Scandinavia continued to integrate longships into their royal fleets until as late as the early 1400s. However, by the time that the cannon-bound caravels and galleons of Spain and Portugal had begun to colonize the world, the longship had been entirely consigned to the pages of history, where its legacy lives on in the passions of the archaeologists, historians, and reenactors who continue to be fascinated by it and the age it represented to this day. More videos on naval history are on the way, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see them. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting, and sharing. It helps immensely. Our patrons and YouTube members can watch more than 200 exclusive videos. Join their ranks via the link in the description or by pressing the join button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.